Oxytocin is a hormone that is released by the posterior pituitary. So it's released by the pars nervosa. So one of the things that we have to remember, right, is our pars nervosa is neurotissue. So it is a neurohormone. So oxytocin is a neurohormone, and it is released as a result of stretch receptors sending a signal to the hypothalamus, right? And so that stretch is a sensory receptor, right? That is a neuron. So this is released as a result of a neural stimulus because the signal or the stimulus is sent through the nervous system or the neurons, right? So these stretch receptors inside of the uterus send a signal to the hypothalamus, which then stimulates the release of oxytocin. So oxytocin specifically is released from the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now, when the oxytocin gets released from the pars nervosa, it enters the bloodstream and it targets smooth muscle of the uterus. Now, when this hormone, oxytocin, targets the smooth muscle of the uterus, it is going to result in smooth muscle contraction. So if you remember back from our signaling molecules and our signal transduction pathways, right, which of those pathways resulted in smooth muscle contraction? That's right, it uses the IP3 or the PIP2 pathway. Okay, so there are going to be receptors on the surface of the smooth muscle cells, right? And this is going to use the IP3 second messenger pathway for the result of the release of calcium from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and that will result in smooth muscle contraction. So if we take a look at sort of the pathway or the steps of oxytocin, right, we can write this out. And the first thing is that stretch receptors on the uterus are activated. Okay, those stretch receptors become activated, and that in turn then sends a signal to the hypothalamus, the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which is then going to stimulate the release of oxytocin from the pars nervosa, or I'll put in parentheses here, posterior pituitary, just so we know. So then oxytocin is going to enter the bloodstream. And it is going to travel to the uterus, where it is released from the bloodstream. Then it will bind to a receptor. Remember, it has to bind to a receptor on the smooth muscle cells. And when it binds, it is going to initiate the IP3 pathway, which will then result in release of calcium from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, okay, which is then going to lead to muscle contraction, or, in other words, uterine contractions. Okay. So when the uterus contracts, right, that is going to then have more signals that send the signal back to the hypothalamus, because more stretch receptors are going to be activated, right? And so if we have a signal that results in a feedback loop that then is going to result in the release of more oxytocin, what do you think we call that, right? Where we have oxytocin being released, and the effect of oxytocin being released leads to more oxytocin being released, right? That is a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loop. Okay, so oxytocin is one of the hormones that results in a positive feedback system.